and welcome to the Virtual American Library in Paris. I'm Alice McCrum, the Libraries Programs Manager. Tonight we have with us, maybe some of you joined us last time in the fall, we have Wright from the New Yorker, Steve Erlanger from the New York Times, and Serge Schmemann from the New York Times formerly, to talk about the war in Ukraine on day 70 of the invasion. We're going to really launch right into it. These conversations tend to go very quickly. Before we do, two quick reminders. First of all, if you haven't done so already, I really encourage you to turn on your videos. It makes a big difference, not only for us to be able to see you, but for you to be able to see each other. And the second note is that towards the end of our conversation, we will be opening up to your questions and comments. So if at any point you have a question or a comment, I urge you to post it in the chat. Robin, let's go to you first. You've been covering America's relationship to the war in Ukraine for the New Yorker, which began, well, a kind of important date was February 24th when you wrote about it for the New Yorker, and you talked about America's initial stance that was one of reaction. You wrote, backed by hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid. At that time, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said that America's goal was to just kind of stand behind the Ukrainian people. Now we are 9 weeks along, we're in May, and this stance has evolved to one you wrote of proactive assertion of American leadership into a full proxy war with Russia, which is now being backed by billions of dollars. The goal, you wrote, has expanded from supporting Ukraine to weakening Russia to outlasting Putin. America has crossed a threshold in Ukraine, both in its short-term involvement and its long-term intent. As we get started here, Robin, can you talk us through the evolving role of the US to this war since it started, and how do you think this role will continue in the months to come?
Well, I think we've crossed a threshold, and that was been reflected in the last 10 days, that the American script has changed. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in amassing defense chiefs from more than 40 countries in Germany, talked about the goal of weakening Russia. It's not just to stand behind the Ukrainian people, but it's to weaken Russia and ensure that they can't do these things in the future. Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the same meeting talked about how the US is going to help ensure that a sovereign, independent Ukraine lasts a lot longer than Vladimir Putin. And then Mark Milley, the general who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has very publicly talked about, if Russia prevails, then the international order that has been in place since World War II will collapse. And these are very stark language, very striking, and from senior US officials. The administration this week has vehemently denied that we are in a proxy war, but it looks, acts, and feels very much like we are confronting Russia with the Ukrainian troops fighting it out on the ground. I think we've reached this turning point for 4 reasons. And the first is that diplomacy for the moment seems deadlocked, stalled, unlikely given the reaction by the Ukrainians to the atrocities since revelations at Bucha. Thousands of civilians have been killed, and there's now documentation and video to prove it. The second is, I think the US has been emboldened in part because of Russia's military failures. That in the early days, we didn't want to poke the Russian bear, we didn't want to provoke Putin personally. And the Russian retreat from around Kyiv, and frankly, its failure to move into the east as effectively or as fast as it intended during the second phase, has underscored that the Russians are not the army, despite being the largest in Europe, that the United States had feared. The third is the growing sense or fear that Russia could move beyond Ukraine. Yeah. That's been something that has resonated among those along the border with Ukraine for a long time. But when a Russian military officer on April 22nd talked about how Russia wants to claim both the East and the South and then move to Moldova, it was very striking to pronounce something publicly. And the final reason is, frankly, that the American public supports the administration's role, and 68% feel that the United States has a moral responsibility to do more. And at a time we are a deeply, deeply polarized nation, the fact there is bipartisan support on this has allowed the Biden administration, I think, to move from reactive to proactive. Now, there are degrees of being proactive, and I don't think I think there is room for more, but the mere fact that the United States, the Biden administration has asked for another $33 billion, which is about half of what the Russian entire defense budget is, and more than half of the annual State Department budget, is just a stunning fact and shows how deeply involved we are. And that's just for the next 5 months.
It strikes me, Robin, we last met as Biden was pulling out of Afghanistan, not wanting to fight any more wars. How is it possible that there is so much support for this, given that there was so much war weariness?
Well, the numbers changed dramatically in the polling about whether US troops should get involved, and the majority are deeply opposed to the idea of American troops getting involved in this war. But there is a sense that the United States should do as much as possible. And the mere fact that in amassing this so-called coalition of nations of goodwill extends beyond NATO, that the US is trying to widen it. But at the same time, Secretary Austin talked about the role that the US must lead this alliance. So whatever the administration says, we're in it now to win it.
Okay. Steve, I'd like to go to you to think about Europe's relationship to the war, which you've been covering for the New York Times, thinking about the two kind of major countries within the European Union. So first, Germany. The effects of the war on Germany have been the biggest foreign policy shift since the Cold War, as Olaf Scholz plans to spend, also enormous amounts of money, 100 billion euros to rearm Germany, including, and also send weapons to Ukraine, and also end the country's dependence on Russian energy. We think about what's happening in France. So now we will have Macron as president for the next 5 years. And I think we learned in the last couple of days that ENGIE, the state-backed utility, has signed up for natural gas from Texas, which is the first US contract with a European buyer. A similar question to you, Steve, as we get started here. How has the war in Ukraine either disrupt foreign policy of the European Union and of European countries, so we can think of Germany, or else how has it greatly accelerated changes that were already in motion, in your opinion?
Well, it's provided a new area of interest and of change. The fundamentals of the EU never seem to change, but there is beginning to be a debate about what responsibility a European Union owes to these borderline countries that are on the eastern flank, that are not part of NATO,
Right.
that have agreements with the EU. If you remember, a lot of what started in Ukraine in 2013, 2014 was because of an EU association agreement with Ukraine, which was rather misjudged, but Putin decided that the president of Ukraine at the time, who had kept Ukraine neutral, shouldn't do this. And that led to the Maidan, which led to Crimea, which led to the Donbass, which leads to where we are. To me, it's a continuum. But people have made, I think everybody made quite a lot of mistakes not taking 2014, 2015 seriously enough. Obama was unwilling to provide weapons to Ukraine in any real way. Everyone just kind of put it aside. And then in general, there was a feeling, if you go back 6 months ago, that Ukraine was quite a corrupt place and Zelensky was quite unpopular. And this sort of notion of Ukraine next to heaven was not the general view. There was basically a general view that Ukraine always disappoints. That was really the line. So it has been you know, a prise de conscience for Europe, for everyone. I think for young people, for the last 30 years, they've been les 30 glorieuses of peace and so on. And now life will change. I mean, there'll be more defense spending, there'll be more of a sense of threat, there'll be a new line in Europe drawn by Russia, but reinforced by NATO, likely to include Sweden and Finland. And quite a lot of anxiety, I have to say, among Europeans, because they're all for helping Ukraine. They're much less convinced that you can weaken Russia or that you can bring Russia to its knees. They don't know what winning in Ukraine means. I don't know what it means either. And I don't know what Russia losing means and whether Putin would allow that to happen. I think we have a long way to go. And this great unity is partly being fractured by, I think, overambitious American goals and not very responsible American language about those aims without defining precisely what they mean. I'll stop there.
Well, like what, for example?
like you know, we want Russia weakened so it cannot do this again. Right? I mean, that's a pretty good example. Or, you know, Nancy Pelosi saying we're going to be with Ukraine until victory. Again, is victory what? Is it, you know, saving Kiev? Is it pushing the Russians back to the line of contact of a year ago? Is it pushing them all the way out of Ukraine? Is that even possible? I mean, nobody wants to talk about those questions. They just want to talk for us, for the media, about victory and some sort of revision of the Cold War. And in the meantime, you have issues like the Iran talks, you have Syria, you have issues on which Russia matters, whether we like it or not. I mean, they are a big part of the world and they are part of the UN Security Council. And, you know, painting them, the whole country, they can't even play at Wimbledon, right? I mean, I wonder what people would have thought if during the Iraq War, Wimbledon had decided no Americans should be able to play. I mean, these are serious questions about balance that many Europeans have. I'm trying to express them. These are not my views particularly, but there are beginning to be doubts about what the United States has in mind really and what it expects its allies to do.
I'd love to read a piece about Wimbledon as the arbiter of humanity or justice. Okay, Serge, let's go to you because you are the, you know, in terms of coverage and body of work, you're the real expert here. And I also feel quite haunted by our discussion about Afghanistan because you were kind of sitting back in the corner saying, well, we should think about Russia. And now here we are thinking only about Russia. And before Russia invaded Ukraine, Serge, at the end of last year, you wrote an opinion piece for The Times recounting the day that the Soviet flag came down. In that piece, you quoted the Russian daily newspaper, Izvestia, which, so 3 decades ago in 1991 printed that the parting with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics will be long and difficult. The Soviet state, you wrote, had denied people freedom, but it had given them something else, the pride of superpower. Superpower, you added, is a hard habit to kick. So my question to you is when the Soviet flag came down in 1991, and indeed, this is a very broad question, but over the last 30 years, did you feel that Russia had kicked its habit, if you like, of a superpower? Did you believe that this is something that it had moved on from?
Well, obviously it has not, because they're all there. But I think, you know, it's very hard to play out scenarios in retrospect. And I think, you know, with the right leadership, with the right messaging, Russians may have been satisfied to build a nice new country and to go ahead with it. But, you know, Putin chose the path of accumulating power. And once you get power, you have to defend it. And you know, nationalism and invoking this habit of empire is one of the easier ways to sort of mobilize people. I mean, all the Russian messaging right now, Putin's messaging has been all around beating Nazis, invoking World War II, and the Americans are leading a campaign to destroy Holy Russia. We're on the defensive. There's a statement by Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church just recently, which is totally astounding. He says, it's amazing that Russia has never fought an offensive war. It has always fought defensive wars. So he's portraying this again as a defensive war against an America West, which is now sort of Nazi and fascist, and is trying to deny Russia its greatness. It works because, as I think, well, what I was trying to say back in 91, or Izvestia was trying to say, is that imperialism, I mean, having an empire is Russia's patriotism, it's Russia's identity. Russian nationalists, or back when Steve and I were in Russia, were a fairly marginalized group. They were seen as kind of scruffy, bearded guys in the forest yelling about birch trees. It wasn't where Russia's identity lay, but empire. The world takes us seriously. Nobody messes us. And Ukraine was very much a part of that narrative. They were our little brothers. Belarusians were our little brothers, and together, we run this great empire that you have to take seriously. And this goes back, what Steve was saying. I think many of these statements by Austin or Biden said, for God's sake, let's get rid of this guy, about Putin. Austin saying we've got to weaken them. These are not helpful statements. They're useful for rallying support. They're true. Obviously, we all think you got to get rid of this guy, but for the president to say this, among other things, feeds right into Russian propaganda, backs Putin into a corner, and I think increases support for him in Russia. Aha, so that's what they're doing. They're destroying Holy Russia. And Kirill goes in there and pitches in. Kirill had another sermon for Easter or Palm Sunday, when he said, we beat the fascists before, we'll do it again. So it's now been shaped into a war of defense. So, I think Tom Friedman is a good column today. It's back to carry a big stick, but keep your mouth shut. We're doing well. Ukraine's doing well. This is not the time to be setting false hopes. And especially, as Steve said, since nobody knows what we're trying to do or what they're trying to do. In the midst of all this, it's best to sort of not speak too much, but show great resolve in other ways.
I wonder, Serge, it strikes me that there's a difference between preserving and expanding empire and then brutalizing a people of a country. Is this, I mean, the Russia that you knew covering it, the Russia that today, you have friends there, and we'll talk about this later in the conversation. How do you reconcile that with the horrible violence that's happening in Ukraine?
Well, I think, in Russia, unfortunately, the kind of good people we all deal with, the artists and tennis players and opera singers, are not really part of the political establishment in Russia. They have very little say over politics. And I'd even say worse, they show no interest in it. I mean, I remember speaking with Russians on election day, intellectuals, and saying, well, what do you think? And they say, oh, it's election day. Oh, politics is so far below me that, that I didn't even know. It's an affectation. And of course, a lot of people did get into it. But politics, as in Soviet times, was left to others. It's considered a dirty thing. So, once again, the intellectuals are fleeing. I've had some friends recently, and they contacted me from Armenia. I can't say more about them. They're all also living in fear. But people are going out. Armenia does not require a visa, and from Armenia, they move on. I had another friend here in the States apply for political asylum, says he can never go back. You know, once again, as in 1917, 1945, you know, the best people are leaving, the intellectuals, the thinkers, and Russia's left to that kind of dark, I don't know what you'd call it, middle Russia, which buys into Putin's line, with which it can resonate because they don't know. He controls the media, he controls what they see on TV. Plus, it's a dictatorship. I mean, he surrounded himself with goons who will throw you in prison for 15 years. So there's terror too and repression. You know, we keep taking away all the yachts of the oligarchs. It's a lot of fun. It's great press. I love seeing these yachts, but that's going to make absolutely no difference to Putin.
Thank you. Okay, Robin, let's go back to you. Thinking more about the Cold War, in part because you've written about the parallels and differences between the Cold War and today's war, in the sense that thinking about the risk of global nuclear war and the nuclear age returning possibly. And so thinking about William Burns on April 14th, so he's the CIA director and former ambassador to Russia, and he warned that given the potential desperation of Putin, so you described that one of the reasons that the US might be emboldened to kind of intervene more is because it's not going very well militarily, kind of strategically for Russia, but what they do have is that they might kind of compensate by using nuclear weapons. So that's what William Burns said on April 14th, and then on April 20th, we saw Russia visibly testing missiles, kind of sending a message to the world saying, you know, certainly a message of fear. But you've pointed out, Robin, in your reporting that there are differences to the kind of nuclear weapons that we're talking about today and the nuclear weapons that we were talking about during the Cold War. That there are major differences in the sense that by the end of the Cold War, it was the US that had an advantage in nuclear weapons. And today, the US is superior in terms of conventional arms, but it's Moscow that has much more strength in terms of its nuclear power. And you also make the distinction, I'd love you to talk about this, the type of nuclear weapons we're talking about has changed. So there are now strategic versus tactical nuclear weapons. So again, Russia has more kind of diverse capabilities as opposed to the US. So the broader question is really, are the parallels to the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war useful, given that there are many changes that have happened? And I hate asking this question, is nuclear war really a threat? I mean, the nuclear weapons, is that really a possibility here?
Well, no one knows. This is, you know, up to one man, Vladimir Putin. But I think what's happened is that there is an uncomfortable consciousness in the United States again about nuclear weapons, which most Americans haven't really thought about since the end of the Cold War. Remember that Mikhail Gorbachev, after accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, had said that the risk of a global nuclear war has practically disappeared. And he said that Washington and Moscow had moved from confrontation to interaction, and in some important cases, partnerships. And so when you think about how much has changed, but it is true. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States engaged with the Soviet Union, with Russia, or even since the 70s, let me say. There have been a number of arms treaties that have tried to reduce the number of strategic nuclear weapons, the kind of big bomb that went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. What there has never been any agreement on is a tactical nuclear weapon, which hasn't really been in American consciousness because they have a shorter range, 300 miles or about 500 kilometers. They often, not always, but often have a lower yield. And the purpose is, it was kind of designed to take out a battalion, a troop formation, a large troop formation, or a formation of tanks, and to be much more limited. But the interesting thing about tactical weapons is that you don't have to fire them just on the ground. They can be used, for example, in a demonstration. Russia, if it wanted to, could fire one into the atmosphere, low or high, and in ways that are not even on Ukraine, that would be over, the Baltic Sea or the Arctic Sea, but a message of, we're willing to cross that threshold. The United States, because we were the one and only power to unleash a nuclear weapon, we kind of think it's one and done. Our goal is to end a war. Whereas Russian military doctrine has long been to think through the use of nuclear war in a conflict, at different stages of a conflict, and not to be a one and done. So there's a lot of thinking in Washington and worrying. At the same time, and I can't emphasize this enough, the Russians, according to US intelligence, have not moved or redeployed their nuclear arsenal. Things are still in place despite the kind of flamboyant rhetoric. But there is this fear that Putin could use a tactical weapon if in desperation, because Russian doctrine also allows for the use of a nuclear weapon when Russia or its leadership fears a conventional threat. So there is a grounds for it to use it. Again, the last thing I want to do is make anyone think, oh, we're on the verge of something. And I'm interested in hearing what Serge says on May 9th, if Putin should declare that this is no longer a special military operation, and this is now outright war, what that does to the parameters of the conflict, the justification for using certain kind of weapons. And I will say that the more the conflict, the Ukrainians are using American and Western weapons closer to the Russian border. And the more often there are these, incidents inside Russia that are traced or believed possibly carried out by the Ukrainians, that this explodes into something bigger. So the more the fighting is along that border, I think the more dangerous the kind of unintended consequences could become. And as we know, every war has those unintended consequences.
So Steve, let's go to you, because when we think about nuclear weapons, we obviously think about NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was established during the Cold War in response to the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Today was the war was not kind of in part triggered by NATO increasing its reach into Eastern Europe, and so kind of helping to foment pre-existing tensions. But one of the outcomes of the war has been the uniting and even strengthening of NATO as formerly non-aligned countries such as Sweden and Finland. So you mentioned that you might be heading to Sweden soon to cover this move towards the Western Alliance. Can you talk about NATO as it relates to the war and how it was kind of instrumental, or at least a factor playing in the run-up to the war?
Happily, I don't really agree with your premise. I don't think NATO is at fault here. Okay. My experience in Russia has been most all of Russia's failures are self-inflicted and come out of itself, rather than being posed upon them by others. But sensible people may disagree. I think the biggest problem NATO did, George W. Bush did, was in 2008 at a summit I covered for the New York Times in Bucharest, when we made this open-ended promise to Ukraine and Georgia that they would become members of NATO, but we didn't define when or how, and never really meant it to happen. And Putin's been trying to shut that door ever since. I mean, that's part of the problem. To some degree, it's a problem of NATO's own creation. And because it touched, as Serge rightly said, Ruski Mir, the Russian world, Ukraine, not just, the Baltics, not annexed places, not Poland, but actual, areas where Russians regard the roots of their people and their faith. It was more akin to a Kosovo. I don't want to get into that particularly, but I don't really blame NATO for this. NATO held out its hand for quite a long time. I think what Putin has in mind is really something different. He was afraid. I mean, one could say that Ukraine wasn't in NATO, but NATO was in Ukraine, but that was really only true after 2014 and after the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, which Russia promoted and actually participated in. So, I mean, NATO is a nuclear alliance. It is openly so. It talks about collective defense. It means it. Biden says rightly, not 1 inch of NATO soil will be undefended, and that includes the Baltics and Poland. But what this war does is it takes Ukraine out of this area of strategic depth for both sides. In a sense, Ukraine was a kind of place where the two sides weren't confronting one another. And so now when you think about that, and you think about Belarus being further under Moscow's hands, and you think about Sweden and Finland, suddenly NATO's borders with Russia will get much, 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 much longer. I mean, a year ago, they weren't very long at all, frankly. So the risk Robin talks about, I think, is real. I don't think Putin has any intention of challenging NATO. He's having enough trouble in Ukraine. This is why I sometimes find the Americans so contradictory. You know, they'll say, oh, he's doing terribly in Ukraine, he's doing terrible, he's so weak, but oh my God, he's about to attack NATO. I mean, the two things really don't go very well together. One worries about accidents, to be sure. And I just wanted to say something very quickly, because you'd asked a very good question, which I didn't answer, about Germany. This Zeitenwende, you know, this change in time, I think is real. And it's important, and it's been imposed upon Germany. Germany's been dragged into it. But the problem is Germany is the same people in the same country, and it has some of the same anxieties that it has always had. But to me, what is important is not that Germany's leading, but that Germany's actually finally participating in a legitimate, real way, not just with money, but with, you know, support and with arms to an important East-West NATO struggle. And this, I think, has changed Germany for a very long time to come, and it's quite important. Scholz is trying to manage a very difficult 3-party coalition, which is very awkward. But I think he's doing it pretty well, and I think we're being, in general, not we, but generally, people are being a bit unfair to Germany, asking it to turn into something immediately that it has never wanted to be. I mean, it is making tremendous progress simply by being an active participant and being vocal in defense of Ukraine and of NATO, and I don't think Germany will walk back from that.
Just thinking more about Germany briefly, do you think it really will try and divest as quickly as possible energy from Russia? Well,
this is part of the problem. I mean, Germany gets a quarter of its coal, 40%, I'm trying to make 35% of its oil from Russia, and 55% of its natural gas. So coal is easy, they can get coal from other places. Oil is fungible. They've said they've made a lot of progress. They think by the end of the year, they can have an embargo on all oil. Gas, they need much more time. They're trying to diversify. I think, you know, it's going to take 18 to 20 months. The problem is, and it is true, I mean, if we suddenly cut off all Russian imports, would the war end? I don't believe so. Not at this point. I think Putin's got too much at stake. So that's not the point. The point is, are we doing things that hurt the Russians more than ourselves? That's an important question. And if Germany goes into deep recession, which I think this would, if we suddenly cut off all energy, all of Central Europe would go into recession too. These are essentially economic colonies of Germany. And I think people underestimate the importance of the German economy for the European economy, let alone the political backlash that would come from that kind of economic catastrophe. So I just think they're going in the right direction. They're slow, they're always slow, but you know, they have real issues, and they're trying, and the Greens are trying, and Schultz is being dragged along. So I think we personally, you know, maybe I'm giving them too much benefit of the doubt. I think we should give them a little bit of space and recognize what they're doing and stop asking them to turn into Estonia, which they're not.
Serge, would you like to add anything to what we've to that?
Yeah. I think Robin asked about May 9th and what may be the changed message. And I think on that front, I think Russia's already changed its message. It did so when it abandoned the drive on Kiev. If you remember in the beginning, the whole notion was we're going to go and kick the Nazis out of Kiev. And I'm sure they thought that it would happen very quickly, which is one of the reasons they didn't prepare their own population for this war at all. Because they thought it would end. And then on May 9th, we would have had a grand parade through Kiev. And already since then, the message to the Russians has focused more on a holy war against NATO being fought out in Kiev. They've already made this, they don't use the word war, they probably won't, but they've already changed the whole image of what they're doing. I think they're going to continue to stay away from threatening nukes. You know, they keep dropping some kind of hint. We have nukes, and then Lavrov comes out and says we're not going to use them. You know, they are as wary as we should be of provoking us, because they're, as Steve says, they're not doing very well at all in this whole operation. We're sending tons of anti-tank weapons. We're sending in tanks. You know, we're going to give them a hell of a rough time once their tanks roll in, which is one of the reasons they're delaying this operation. It began as a operation of the FSB, that's the KGB. It now has become a unified military operation. So it has changed into a war, you know, we can guess what their goals are. So I think on May 9th, they're going to make some noises. They're going to have a parade through Mariupol. Today I read that they're clearing out that destroyed theater so they can have a nice parade. And one goal, I think, maybe less than threatening nuclear weapons, would be to justify sending recruits. So far, they claim they're not sending recruits, but pretty soon they're going to start needing fresh troops, and they're going to have to start sending draftees. So they're probably going to issue some pretty frightening sounds for domestic consumption in order to justify sending in recruits. That's on that front. But I think on the NATO front, you know, as Steve has said, basically after 91, we had no idea what NATO is. It became a club where any country, you know, that wanted, I mean, it was the only organization, European organization, and significant that the United States still had a role. So it was something we wanted to hold on. We didn't know what it was. And we've only recovered NATO in any significant way since 2014. And now it's a very dangerous thing, because, you know, if Finland goes in and, you know, a company of Russian soldiers get lost up those woods, we'd have to go to war. We have to go to war on behalf of countries that we really can't trust. So even though I can't see how we can avoid letting in Sweden and Finland, I would love to see some kind of serious discussion within NATO about what the hell it is. You know, are we really prepared now to come back to a serious opposition to Russia, whatever may come of it, right up along the Finnish border, the Polish border with Belarus, all the borders, you know, Ukraine, anything could become now a place that is could start a war. And we haven't really faced up to it. We haven't redefined it. And I would hope that the application of Finland and Sweden, instead of being kind of automatically accepted, would lead to some kind, I mean, I think in the end we have to accept them, but that it should include some serious soul searching about what this alliance means. Do we want to sort of perpetuate this hostility with Russia? Do we want to leave a door open for Russia? I mean, we're entering into very dangerous kind of unknowns on all fronts. And this might be a good time to sort of use NATO to think about it. You know, as Steve said, Germany might have a completely different idea about, or anybody on Russia's front lines, about what they think NATO should be. That's
great. Robin, I'm going to go to you briefly. I just want to ask Serge one more question, which is more kind of an emotional one, in the sense that your most recent op-ed for the New York Times was essentially expressing sadness. I mean, you know, we've been talking a lot about rhetoric and scripts over the course of this conversation, and one script and one kind of point of view that we're not hearing, of course, from the Russians, because the Ukrainians are suffering so much. But we have to remember that Russia, there are, you know, 144.1 billion people living in Russia today, and not all of them are evil, and not all of them are watching the news and not really know what's happening outside of it. And you mentioned that you've been in touch with friends in the country, friends who have left the country, and in your most recent opinion piece, your essential argument was that this war has set a country that had a lot of potential back by decades. And I think your final paragraph is very moving. You wrote, what Russians are enduring, of course, comes nowhere close to the suffering and destruction of Ukraine, but looking back to the promise of that sweet victory more than 30 years ago, it is heart-wrenching to witness what Mr. Putin has wrought on his own country.
It is. And, you know, to think Putin is doing all this in the name of a great Russia. So then I go back over history, and it's amazing how consistently Russian governments destroy Russia's greatness. I mean, how many of Russia's best poets, writers, hockey players, whatever, end up in the West? It's, you know, they just can't. Putin's in a long line of people who define Russian greatness in a kind of a totally destructive way. We have to be feared. You know, I remember somebody saying that to Putin at a meeting up in Normandy. He said, just make sure the world continues to fear Russia. You know, that's his definition of greatness. But on the other hand, Russia is great. The land mass is extraordinary. In many ways, it is a great country. And so, yeah, for me, it's I mean, just a matter of great personal sadness that Putin, with his sidekick, Kirill, whom I knew quite well, the patriarch, you know, are just going all out to destroy it for the rest of my life, for certain, but for how many generations to come, I don't know. You know, I was giving a toast at a wedding the other day, and when I mentioned some Russian tradition, there were hisses and boos. It was all in good fun, but that's the reaction now. Get them out. That's going to last a while. And yeah, I guess sadness is the only way I can say it. You know, do they deserve it? Probably. Did they not stop Putin from becoming what he is? Probably. And yet there was a moment when we could have hoped that it would go in another direction.
Robin, let's go to you to kind of take a different direction here at the end. You wrote about the limits of sanctions, and so kind of following on from what Steve was saying about Germany, but not only Germany, all European countries. You know, we have to remember that European countries get 40% of their energy from Russia. You wrote about the limits of sanctions, particularly in terms of energy. So even if the West does opt to sanction Russian energy, which it's not currently doing, it could backfire. It could create an oil crisis in the West. It could drive up global prices, and Russia could just simply switch to other buyers. So there is a lot of talk. I mean, especially I think kind of representing the European contingent here, along with Steve, there's a lot of talk on the European continent, especially with thinking about the environment and the climate crisis, to move away from Russia in terms of energy. But how effective would that actually be, and what would be effective if not divesting?
Well, in confronting aggression, there are basically two big tools. One is military and one is economic sanctions. And the United States has used economic sanctions repeatedly. And I've been in many of the countries, lived in many of the countries that we've sanctioned, South Africa and Rhodesia. I've been in North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela and Iraq and Iran. And you look at, today, Cuba still has a communist government dating back 60 years. And Iran, manages to sell over 1 million barrels a day, despite, draconian sanctions. North Korea has been testing new missiles, intercontinental missiles again. So sanctions are a long haul tool. And the problem is it'll be very important if Europe takes that step. But the problem is there are major players around the world, notably China, India, players like South Africa, important in the mood of the non-aligned conference, Brazil, that have not been willing to take big steps, that in a way, punitive steps against Russia. And as united as the Western alliance may be today, the reality is that there is a huge fissure, much deeper, between countries that the United States had long hoped would be friendly. India being a notable example. Several countries in Africa rely for their arms in the midst of their own civil strife on Russian weapons. And so the idea that sanctions are going to turn Putin, as Serge points out, watching all these yachts being taken are fun, but it has negligible impact on, what Putin thinks or does. I can, if you'll indulge me just for a minute, because I spent a lot of time talking to US officials and people who've spent their lives involved in one way or another in Ukraine about what does happen, what is winning or what happens next. And I think there are some different scenarios. And one is that we get into a point where Russia has, enlarged its holdings in the Donbass and controls largely the south. Whether or not they get Odessa, that will be very important in leaving, Ukraine landlocked. But that scenario sees that maybe there's a point at which the Russians kind of halt their military activities, trying to create a fait accompli, kind of like a North and South Korea reality, that there's no end of the war, but there are no kind of active front lines or tensions, and that they open the way for diplomacy that goes nowhere, and so we're just stuck with a kind of stasis of a North and South Korea. The second is some kind of cataclysmic event, whether happens to the Russian military or to Putin, within Russia, that changes kind of the flow of events, the Russian reality. And the third and unlikely one is the Ukrainians win. And the danger is that if the more the US commits to some version of winning, and I think the Ukrainians are at a point that they're so angry about the atrocities that it would be very hard for Zelensky to say, okay, we'll go back to where things were February 24th, and with Russian control of Crimea and part of Donbass. So, in looking, how does this, there's a lot of thinking in Washington, a lot of debating about what the next phase goes. And I think there's a reason that Biden has talked about 5 months and so forth, and then they'll revisit, related in part to, the timing of the US fiscal budget. But I think everyone thinks this is going to last a long time. And it may be that this war is a little bit like the war to gain and annex Crimea, is that this is, Crimea was part one of a war, Donbass and the South are part two, and there's a part three that's down the road. And I think that's what people are looking at now.
Thank you. I have a final question that's to any of you, which is that, so Steve said, this is the first time, certainly like my generation has had, apart from the Iraq War, we were yet quite young, after the Trente Glorieuses of peacetime. This is the first war, it's on the European continent. That a lot has been said about that, the way that this war has been covered, the way we're talking about this war in terms of Europeans, not Europeans, how we're welcoming refugees in the way that we didn't welcome other refugees. But certainly what struck many people as I was reading about this today, and have been reading about it for the whole time, is that with the use of social media, and the kind of acceleration of journalism now, that we're receiving more images than ever, more videos, more descriptions of the military movements, of the atrocities, the amount of live tweeting, the amount of professional international reporters who are out there, including local media and just regular kind of citizen journalists. From all of your perspective, you've all covered many wars for many years. Has this war, in terms of coverage, have you noticed a difference kind of in a post-Zoom world? You know, certainly we can think of Zelensky zooming in to address the Finnish parliament in April 8th. You know, the Zani Mintabolis, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, going to Zelensky's room and getting that kind of big interview. Zelensky then going on the cover of Time magazine. I mean, to what extent is this a new phase of journalism, war journalism?
I'll start, I guess. I mean, I'm amazed. I think Zelensky's amazed himself. He's certainly amazed everyone else. This is not the Zelensky that we expected. And it's remarkable. I mean, it shows the power of a person being willing to stay, unlike, for example, Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, and who's, you know, was not popular, who was having all kinds of fights with people like Poroshenko, who was, you know, but suddenly he's a wonderful moral scold to the world and a wonderful symbol. And it's all media, and he has good speechwriters, and he knows television, and it's very well done. And he's in among the people, while you contrast him with Putin 20 feet away from everyone else from this hideous white table, right? It's just a very different notion of what leadership is. It feels like democracy versus authoritarianism. That's the kind of symbolism, which is quite interesting. The other thing I would say, and I mean no criticism of myself, even, let alone my colleagues, but it is very one-sided coverage, almost inevitably. We have one side of the war that we see, and the other side of the war we don't see, because the way Moscow has created its laws, it's very difficult to report from Moscow, particularly for Westerners. You can't call it a war. You get Russian propaganda news from its side of the war, but I've never seen a war, actually. I've never covered a war where we've only covered one side. And I'm not making any sort of moral judgment here. I'm not saying, you know, that the Russians have some great case to make, but I find it kind of odd. And you know, I'm not sure I have an answer for it. It's just, since you asked what impressed me about the difference, this is one of the things that impressed me.
Yeah, maybe I can add one word here. I think you're right, Alice, in that, as far as I can tell, this is the first true information war. I mean, this began before it broke out. Russia saying, you know, they're having exercises, and Washington issuing, you know, raw and credible intelligence and telling us, no, you're not. This is what you're doing. This is what you're going to do. And this is what we know. So the information struggle has been very real. And here Zelensky, Steve says, being an actor, has really done an excellent job. Russia has actually done some really good propaganda in Africa and South America, telling them that, you know, we're actually fighting against America becoming a major hegemon. I mean, there are major informational battles going on. And I think the United States has shown a great amount of sophistication since 2014, when we were caught off guard by Crimea and had nothing to answer. This time we've got a real, we're really out there fighting. And I think we've scored some battles. We've scored some victories. I mean, it's maybe not hard to win victories right now, because it's so obvious who the bad guy is, but it's going to get tougher. And I think the part of this war is going to continue being very important as we develop Ukraine fatigue, which is already setting in. We don't have a long attention span in the West. So we're going to need to really crank up the information to keep it going.
Mm.
But I think you're on to a good thing, and I think this war will be studied for that new front.
Mm. Robin?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is the administration has been astounding in the amount of information it's provided, the daily briefings that are very focused, very detailed from the Pentagon, how the Ukrainians are doing, where they're doing well, where the Russians aren't doing well. That it wasn't just the run up to the war, but it's been astounding. All three of us have covered U.S. policy for a very long time, and the number of phone calls being made by the White House, by the National Security Council, by the State Department, by the Defense Department, by Treasury, by Commerce, it's across the administration. Anna Lindh, the Swedish foreign minister, is in Washington today. That there's a meeting. The U.S. has been very aggressive in gathering, not just first NATO and now expanding it and trying to broaden it out. They're working very hard on South Africa. The Undersecretary of State, Wendy Sherman, is there today. There have been calls every few days from somebody trying to get the South Africans to, say something negative about the Russians. But the Soviet Union had been so supportive of the anti-apartheid movement that a Black majority government has been very reluctant to criticize Moscow. And so it's been fascinating to watch. And I think I give credit to President Biden in organizing, whether you agree with what the US is doing or not, they are being far more transparent than we have been in other wars. Look at Afghanistan, where you had to squeak it out of somebody, or if a general or like Admiral McCraven got fired for talking to Rolling Stone and talking about candidly what the state of the war was. That this time we're providing more information. I think Serge is right. This is a threshold, not just because of social media.
Wonderful. Okay, we have a great question. I want to get to this question in the chat before we wrap up. This is from J. Paul Horn, who writes, what does Putin's aggression in Ukraine say about his assessment of weakness, political, economic, and social in the US and EU? Might he be right that we're not up to defending liberal democracy?
I could take. There were actually some interesting articles written before the buildup began in Russia, and the Dmitry Trenin, who was the Carnegie man in Moscow until they shut it down, sent me some links and told me to read these carefully, because they described Putin's new approach to the West. And part of it was based on his conviction that the West was in serious decline and would not be able to mount a unified resistance. I mean, perhaps he lives in a bubble, perhaps he gets his information, from his own people who try to tell him what he wants to hear. But his whole big speech with Xi, when they got together, was also filled with this conviction that the West is on its last legs. I think he was fairly convinced that the West would not put up any resistance, that they're not going to waste money on Ukraine. He saw all these symptoms of how unpopular Zelensky was. He'd seen Trump make a fool out of Zelensky, or vice versa. But I think there was a definite sense that the West is going to be a major foe.
I mean, Paul makes a good point, and I would just add one thing to what Serge said, which is I think when Putin met Biden in Vienna in June, I think he sensed weakness, because I think this was, he just didn't think the West could hold it together. After all, we didn't do much about Crimea. We didn't do much about Syria. If Putin's a war criminal now, why isn't he a war criminal over Syria? I mean, one has to ask that question. What's happened what they did in Syria so far is certainly as bad as what they're doing now, if not worse. And there was COVID and so on. So I do think he believed, and certainly Xi Jinping believes, the West is declining. But It's a bit like Ivan Kostyev, the Bulgarian analyst, said. Putin has tried to say there's no Ukrainian nation, and he's created one. And in a way, he's tried to say there's no West, and he's restored one. And this may be the real legacy of this very unfinished war, by the way.
That's interesting. Robin, I'd love to actually end with you on that, because you were saying before that you felt that there was this, that this had brought together a divided America, and that you were worried that the Roe v. Wade news is going to actually re-sow that division. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, very, very briefly. I think Serge and I both feel, since we're in Washington, the sense that American attention has dramatically shifted from foreign policy to domestic policy again, and that while we were united in an unusual way, 68% supported, felt we should do more morally for Ukraine, that you see the real split, the angry fury over by both sides now over this the question of abortion, and Serge was right in saying that our attention span is diminished, and I worry a lot about whatever the intent is. Remember that $33 billion has not been allocated. The U.S. has run out of funds, and the kind of divisions we feel could resurface when it comes to, are we going to allocate that money and to pay for those arms to help Ukraine, and how our domestic debate could end up having a profound impact on foreign policy.